Have you ever felt like your character in a game was just so powerful? Like maybe even too easy? Like you could just, I don't know, take on anything the game threw at you?
Oh yeah, I know that feeling. Just last week I was running a game, and one of my players, well, their character with their multi-class combo, they just completely destroyed this encounter. Like, I had spent so much time planning this encounter for the whole party. It was like watching a super carefully built strategy just crumble right before my eyes. I was kind of shocked, honestly, at how easily they handled it.
Yeah, that's multi-classing in D&D for you. The potential is huge for creating these crazy, powerful characters, and they can really change things up. So that's what we're looking at today. We're going to explore some of these notorious, game-breaking multi-class combos.
And we'll be using some awesome resources. From LitRPG Reads and D&D expert Isaac Hansen, they break down these builds in a way that's really helpful.
Okay, so first up, the Sorcerer. This legendary combo of the Hexblade Warlock and the Paladin.
This build is all about that charisma. See, both Paladins and Hexblade Warlocks use charisma. It's their primary ability for spellcasting and attacks. So a high charisma means a higher spell save DC, so it's harder for enemies to resist their spells. And it also means they've got a better chance to hit with attacks, and a higher save bonus, which makes them really hard to take down.
And then there's Divine Smite. Paladins can use spell slots to add radiant damage to their attacks. Warlocks get their spell slots back on a short rest. So the Sorcerer can use those Divine Smites way more than a regular Paladin, leading to some serious damage.
It's like the perfect mix of offense and defense. That makes this build a favorite for players who like to dominate in combat. But like, as a DM, how do you counter that? A character that's amazing at everything?
That's a good question. And it leads perfectly to our next build, one that's all about striking from the shadows, often before the enemy even knows what hit them. The Gloom Stalker Ranger, mixed with the Assassin Rogue.
This one is all about surprise. The Gloom Stalker gets an extra attack on the first turn of combat. They also get bonuses to initiative and damage rolls. Then you mix that with the Assassin's ability to just automatically crit on a surprised creature. You're talking about a crazy strong first round attack.
Sounds like a nightmare for a DM. A character in the shadows that can take out a main enemy before they can even do anything. But there must be ways to counter this, right?
For sure. One of the best ways to counter surprise attacks is to make the enemies more aware. So give your creatures bonuses to their passive perception scores. Or use creatures that have special senses, like Tremor Sense or Blind Sense. It'll be way harder for the rogue to stay hidden. Or you can design encounters that don't just rely on a single important target, so the players have to spread their damage out.
Speaking of damage, if self isn't your thing, maybe you like the more straightforward, brutal style of the Barbarian fighter, specifically the champion archetype.
This combo, all about those crits. Fighters with the champion archetype get a bigger crit range, so they crit on a 19 or 20 on the d20. Now add in the Barbarian's brutal critical feature, which lets them roll more damage dice when they crit. You're talking massive damage.
I can just imagine a Barbarian totally enraged, landing a crit, and then rolling a ton of dice for damage. That must be awesome to see. But is this build a little too one-dimensional? Like, how do you keep it interesting beyond just hitting things super hard?
That's where the role-playing comes in. So, mechanically, the build might seem simple, but it's up to the player to really make their character's personality and motivations come alive. Maybe this Barbarian fighter wants revenge, or maybe they're just a quiet protector, using their strength to shield the weak. You gotta find that story. That gives their actions real meaning.
That's true. It's easy to get caught up in the mechanics,
right,
but role-playing is what really makes it all come together.
Now, if you're more into versatility and casting spells, we have to talk about the Sorcerer Warlock multi-class. It's called the Sorclock.
Oh yeah, the Sorclock, known for being flexible with magic. But what about managing all those resources, the sorcery points, and the Warlock spell slots? That sounds complicated. How do you keep it from being too much?
Well, yeah, it's true. The Sorclock does need a little more tracking than some other builds, but it can be really powerful. So sorcerers have sorcery points. They can use them to make more spell slots. Warlocks get their spell slots back on a short rest, unlike other classes. By combining these things, the Sorclock can cast way more spells than if they were just one class, especially at higher levels.
So they can just blast their enemies with a ton of spells. Sounds pretty efficient. But strategy must be important, right? It can't just be about blasting away with whatever spell you feel like.
You got it. The real power of the Sorclock is how adaptable they are. They can choose spells and invocations that work in all kinds of situations, so they're super versatile.
Okay, so we've got characters who can blast you with magic, characters who hit like a truck, and characters who can stab you in the back before you even know they're there. Anything else?
Well, there are also those who prefer a little more finesse. You know, the ones who move through combat gracefully. I'm talking about the fighter rogue multi-class, with the rogue going for the swashbuckler archetype.
I've always been fascinated by the Swashbuckler. Have you seen any interesting ways people use its features? Like outside of just combat?
Oh, tons of ways. I had a swashbuckler in one of my campaigns. They used their charm and charisma to sneak into this fancy gala, gathering info and manipulating people without ever even pulling out their weapon. They could just move through social situations so easily, thanks to their fancy footwork, you know, which lets them disengage or move without provoking opportunity attacks. They were like a social chameleon, but of course in combat they were just as impressive.
So how does this combo work mechanically? Why are they so dangerous?
The key is how the swashbuckler can use sneak attack damage without needing advantage on their attack roll. Normally rogues need advantage, or their target has to be close to an ally to use sneak attack, but swashbucklers, they can do it whenever they attack with a finesse weapon, as long as no other creatures are within 5 feet of them. Then combine that with the fighter's ability to make multiple attacks per round, and you've got a character that can do a lot of damage, is super mobile, and really precise.
So it's like watching a master sword fighter at work, weaving in and out of combat, landing those perfect strikes, while also being able to charm their way through any social situation. Sounds fun to role play and fun to play in combat.
Exactly. It's like the swashbuckler adds a whole new level of style and personality to the fighter.
Okay, now, to all the dungeon masters out there, I know you're thinking, how do you even design encounters to challenge these crazy, powerful multi-class builds?
That's the big question. But don't worry, there are ways to make sure your encounters are balanced and fun. Even when you're facing these super strong heroes, you gotta understand how these builds work and find ways to use their weaknesses.
All right, let's get into that. What can DMs do to keep these powerful characters on their toes?
First, remember that not every encounter has to be a life or death battle. Sometimes the most fun challenges are about solving problems and working as a team, not just using brute force.
So like, don't be afraid to throw in some puzzles, riddles, or social encounters that make the players think differently and use their skills in new ways. Just because a character can defeat a bunch of orcs doesn't mean they can solve a tough riddle or figure out a complicated political situation.
Exactly. You gotta make them think strategically and use their abilities in creative ways.
Like if you're facing a Sorcerer, you could have enemies or environments that are resistant or immune to magic. Then they'll have to use their fighting skills more and find ways to deal with their weaknesses. What about our sneaky Gloom Stalker Assassin Rogue? How do you challenge a character who's great at surprise attacks?
One way is to make the enemies more aware. Give them bonuses to their passive perception. That'll make it harder for the rogue to sneak up on them. You can also use enemies with special senses, like thermal sense or blind sense. And don't forget about the environment. A well-lit room or a noisy place can totally mess up a stealthy approach. They'll have to adapt.
Smart. That makes the players think about where they are and how to approach the fight, not just rely on their usual tricks. What about our Barbarian fighter combo? They seem pretty unstoppable when it comes to damage.
Sure.
How do you make an encounter that can actually stand up to that kind of power?
Well, barbarians are weak when they're not raging. You can use that. Have enemies that can inflict conditions that stop their rage, like fear or charm.
Ah, so they have to choose. Stay enraged and risk being affected by the condition, or break their rage and lose all that extra damage. Clever. Speaking of weaknesses, what about our versatile Sword Clock? How do you challenge a character who seems like they can cast any spell they want?
You can try limiting their resources. Have encounters that drain their spell slots or sorcery points. Then they have to be more careful about which spells they use. You could also have enemies or places that are resistant or immune to certain types of magic. So they have to adapt and find other solutions.
So it's about making them manage their resources carefully and think beyond their usual spellcasting tactics. We can't forget about our nimble fighter rogue. How do you keep them from just running circles around their opponents? Terrain has to be important here, right?
Terrain is key. Make places with difficult terrain or obstacles that slow them down. That'll force them to fight more directly. Think narrow hallways, thick forests, or rooms with lots of furniture. These kinds of environments can really limit their movement and make them fight on your terms.
I like it. Make them work for those fancy moves and flanking positions. So the key to challenging these powerful builds is to be creative and focus on their weaknesses.
Exactly. Don't be afraid to change things up and keep your players guessing. Remember, a good challenge isn't about overwhelming your players. It's about getting them to think strategically, work together, and find solutions to the problems you give them.
So it's about finding the sweet spot between challenge and fun. You want to push your players, but not make them feel like their characters are useless or completely outmatched. And let's be honest, sometimes those overpowered moments can be really memorable, as long as there are also challenges that require everyone in the party to contribute.
Totally. It's all about making sure everyone at the table has a dynamic and engaging experience. You know, it's really interesting to think about how these multi-class builds can actually change the story of a campaign. And it's not just about the fights either. Think about the role-playing possibilities.
Totally. A character's backstory and why they do things can be so much more interesting when you think about their multi-class choices.
Yeah.
Like it adds another level to their personality, makes them more complex.
Right, like the Sorcerer. Their whole journey could be about trying to balance their divine oath with, like, their pact with this powerful, otherworldly being. It creates this awesome conflict inside them that can shape what they do throughout the whole campaign. Or maybe you have a Gloom Stalker assassin rogue, and they're, like, haunted by the darkness they've embraced. They're constantly fighting to hold on to their humanity while living in the shadows.
That's a great point. The conflicts that can come from multi-classing, they can be so interesting for role-playing. It's like having two sides of the same person, always fighting for control. And it's not just about internal struggles either, is it? Multi-classing can also really affect how a character interacts with other people.
Absolutely. Like, imagine a swashbuckler fighter rogue who can charm their way into or out of anything. They might find themselves caught up in some crazy courtly intrigue. Or maybe they're using their skills to outsmart some cunning rivals. Their multi-class abilities give them all sorts of new ways to interact with people and a ton of new role-playing opportunities.
It's like giving your character a whole new set of tools to use in social situations. They can be just as dangerous with their words as they are with their weapons. It's a fantastic way to make a character's story more interesting and complex.
I think that's one of the best things about multiclassing. It's not just about making a strong character, it's about having more options for storytelling and making a character that's truly unique. It adds this layer of complexity and detail that can really make your character stand out and lead to some really cool moments in the game.
Speaking of cool moments, let's talk about some tips for dungeon masters who might be dealing with these really powerful multi-class builds in all campaigns. We've already talked about some strategies for combat, but what about managing the overall power level of the game?
That's really important. One of the toughest things for DMs is to make sure the game stays balanced and fun for everyone. It doesn't matter what kind of character they're playing. You don't want one player to outshine everyone else or make other players feel like what they do doesn't matter.
So how do you do that? How do you make sure everyone feels like they're contributing to the story, even when you've got these super powerful multi-class characters in the mix?
You have to talk to each other. Before the campaign even starts, it's super important to have an open conversation with your players. Talk about their character ideas and their multi-classing plans. That'll help you figure out how powerful the group is overall. And you can make changes to your campaign world if you need to. It's about setting expectations from the beginning and making sure everyone's on the same page.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels comfortable talking about their ideas and what they want from the game. And it's not just a one-time thing, right? You need to keep checking in with your players as the campaign goes on.
Yeah, definitely. Make sure you check in with your players every so often to see how they feel about the balance of the game. Are they having fun? Are they feeling challenged? Do they feel like their characters are making a difference in the story? It's an ongoing conversation that helps make sure everyone feels heard and that the game stays fun for everyone.
Let's get into some specific ways to manage power creep in a campaign. What are some practical things a DM can do to keep things balanced and challenging, even when they're up against these really tough multi-class builds?
One thing you can do is adjust how fast characters level up. You can slow down how quickly they gain levels. That gives you more time to introduce challenges and plot points that keep them engaged. And it keeps characters from getting too powerful too quickly. It gives you more control over how the game progresses.
That makes sense. It's about finding that balance between how characters progress and the challenges they face. You don't want them to get ahead of the story or become so strong that they feel like they can't be beat.
Another strategy is to tie leveling up to important moments in the story, instead of just giving them a level after every fight. This makes players focus more on the story and how their characters are developing, instead of just trying to gain experience points. Leveling up feels more important and has a real purpose.
I like that. It's not just about getting stronger, it's about achieving something meaningful in the story. It gives those moments of character growth more weight and importance.
And when you're designing encounters, remember that you don't always have to throw stronger enemies at your players to make it a challenge. You can use things like environmental hazards, traps, puzzles, and social encounters. These kinds of challenges make the players think creatively and use their skills in different ways.
It's like using the environment as another character in the game, right?
Yeah.
It can make encounters so much more interesting and unpredictable. Like a collapsing ceiling could really mess up a barbarian's rage if they suddenly have to worry about surviving instead of attacking.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to think outside the box when it comes to rewards. Instead of just giving out magic items and gold, try giving your players unique benefits, allies, or opportunities that connect to their characters' backstories and goals.
I like that. It makes rewards feel more personal and meaningful, and it can really help to move the story along. It's about giving them something that really resonates with their character and their journey, something that's more than just a number bonus.
And don't forget about teamwork. Encourage your players to work together. Design encounters that make them cooperate and use their abilities together to succeed.
For sure. It not only helps to balance out how powerful the party is, but it also reminds everyone how important it is to work together and be good friends, which are super important in D&D. It shows that even the strongest characters can't do everything alone. They need their party, their friends, to help them overcome challenges.
And finally, remember that D&D is all about using your imagination and telling stories. Don't be afraid to experiment, try new things, and most importantly, have fun. It's a game that's all about creativity and working together. Go with the flow, be flexible, and let the story unfold in its own way.
I totally agree. It's a game that everyone should enjoy. So relax, let your imaginations go wild, and create some awesome stories together.
It's amazing how these multi-class builds can make us think about game balance, storytelling, and what makes D&D so interesting. It shows how deep the game is and how creative the players and dungeon masters are.
Totally. It's a game that's always changing and surprising us. That's why we keep coming back for more. But before we finish up this part, let's take a moment to acknowledge what LitRPG Reads and Isaac Hansen have done to help us understand these powerful class combinations. Their insights have been so valuable to our discussion today.
Absolutely. Their knowledge and love for D&D are so inspiring.
Here's a question we'd like to leave you with. If you could create a multi-class build that perfectly represents your ideal D&D character, what would it be? What classes would you combine? What kind of special abilities and playstyle would you want? We want you to let your imaginations run wild. Share your dream multi-class builds in the comments below. We can't wait to see what you come up with. It's amazing how just a few rules can create so many possibilities and so much imagination. These multi-class builds, they're not just about stats and abilities, they really reflect the players themselves, their own ideas for their characters and the stories they want to tell.
Yeah, each multi-class build is like totally unique, like a fingerprint. It shows what's so cool about D&D. It's a game that's all about being yourself and coming up with new ideas. There's no right way to play, no single way to win. It's about finding what works for you and what sparks your imagination and creating something really special.
D&D is like this huge sandbox. And multi-classing is like getting a whole new set of toys to play with. You can build anything you can think of. It's about trying new things, pushing the limits of what you thought was possible, and making a character that's truly unique and one that people will remember.
And it's not just about the characters either. It's about how they change the world around them, the stories they're a part of, and the things they leave behind. A really well-made multi-class build can lead to epic adventures, unexpected team-ups, and those crazy moments of victory and loss that stick with you even after the game is over.
Think about the story potential of a Sorcerer. They're torn between their divine oath and their pact with a powerful fiend. Do they give in to the darkness? Or do they overcome their struggles and become a symbol of good? Or imagine a Gloom Stalker assassin rogue. They have to face the darkness they've embraced to protect the innocent. These are the kinds of stories that multiclassing can create. Stories full of conflict, growth, and that constant battle between good and evil.
And let's not forget about the Dungeon Master. They have a big part to play in all of this. A good DM can take these multi-class builds and weave them into the story of their campaign. creating challenges and opportunities that use the character's strengths and weaknesses, pushing them to their limits, and forcing them to make tough choices. It's like a back and forth between the players and the DM, each one inspiring the other to be more creative.
It's like watching a tapestry being made, thread by thread. Each player and the DM adding their own unique touches, creating something amazing that's bigger than all the individual parts. And when that happens, when everyone's working together to create a truly immersive experience, that's when D&D is at its best.
We could talk for hours about how complex multiclassing is, and all the possibilities it offers. But we've reached the end of our deep dive for today.
But before we go, we want to give a shout out to LitRPG Reads and Paul Bello. They've done some fantastic work breaking down these powerful class combos. Their insights have been so helpful for us in this discussion. We definitely recommend checking out their work if you want to learn more about multiclassing in D&D.
Absolutely. They're an amazing resource for anyone who wants to understand D&D better and discover all the possibilities for creating characters.
And now, for our listeners, we'll leave you with this. As you go on your own D&D adventures, remember that what makes D&D special is the freedom to create, explore, and tell stories that you and your friends connect with. It doesn't matter if you're a seasoned player or just starting out.
Embrace multiclassing, but never forget that the real magic of D&D comes from friendships, shared adventures, and telling stories together.
So gather your party, roll those dice, and let the adventures begin.
Until next time, may your journeys be full of epic battles, amazing discoveries, and memories you'll never forget.
And as always, happy adventuring.